Joining us right now via telephone is Raymond Arroyo, author of The Wisemen Who Found Christmas, published by Sophia Institute Press. Good morning to you, Raymond.
Hey, great to be with you, Joe. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, praise be to God. Thank you for your time, and we're grateful that we got you back on. There was a mix-up a couple weeks ago. But this book I found interesting, especially as, yes, it's a beautiful children's family book, that's true, but it seems like you put a lot more effort into an illustrated children's book than the normal author would. You did some deep dive research on the myths, and you seem to be busting a few of these myths. Tell us about the background.
You know, Joe, I wrote a book called The Spider Who Saved Christmas a few Christmases ago. It continues to be a bestseller, and people love that story. So that's based on an old legend. It kind of falls in the cracks of the gospel. What happened to the Holy Family on their way to Egypt? They went into a cave, and there is this story, and it's the reason we decorate our trees with tinsel. And, Joe, I love stories that illuminate and widen our perspective on a story we took for granted or a practice we take for granted. So I was kicking around looking for a legend about the wise men that might also sort of fit in the cracks, tell us something we don't know, and then when the more I dug, the more I realized everything we know about these wise men is mostly legendary. The old song, "We Three Kings of Orient are." They weren't three. They weren't kings. They weren't from the Far East. So once you know that, and you get that from 1st and 2nd century sources, they all say they were from Arabia. The Coptic Church says there were 60 wise men. The Armenian Church and Syrian Church says there were probably 12. So the truth is we don't know, but the Gospel only talks about 3 gifts, not 3 wise men. So I thought I've got to dig into this and find out what's the reality here, who these men were, and where did they actually come from, and what drove them to go to this Christ child. And it began an 8-month research project on my part, and I contacted some of the renowned biblical scholars, ancient world historians, archaeologists, astronomers, and I learned so much. And I thought, I shouldn't put this into a chapter book. No one will read it. I should put this into a picture book where families can get their hands on it, and it can open up their thinking, open up their historical perspective through a great adventurous tale, which is what you find when you burrow down to the history of it. It's far more interesting than the boring 3 kings procession we've been led to believe, characterizes these wise men.
All right, so if they're not kings, who are they?
Yep.
And if they're not from the Far East, where are they from?
Well, the gospel says men from the East. East meaning Petra, modern-day Petra, the kingdom of Nabateh. Clement of Rome, Justin Martyr in the 1st century, says the wise men came from Arabia. So there's only one candidate. It would have to be the kingdom of Nabatea. That was the headquarters, if you will, of Arabia. It's also where all 3 of those commodities that they bring the Christ child, frankincense, gold, myrrh, only the kingdom of Nabateh either controlled or manufactured those goods. Myrrh and frankincense comes from tree sap, which I didn't know until I started exploring this. And those trees only grow in southern Arabia. The gold mines of Midian, the King Solomon's mines, real places, archaeologically verifiable, controlled by the kingdom of Nabatea. So it makes sense that the king of Nabatea would have sent his magi, who were just his royal consultants, wise men, astrologers, mathematicians, theologians. These were men who knew things the king didn't. And you go into the Old Testament, you see Daniel interpreting dreams for the king. All of this is part of that ancient world. So that's who the Magi were. They may have been Persian priests or expelled from Persia because that caste of priests had already been, they tried a coup and basically the Parthians expelled them. Too much history to go into here. But maybe they were Babylonian Persian priests living in Petra, or better candidate. And there's a wonderful researcher, Margaret Barker, who has a theory that I subscribe to. but that I hint at in the book, but I don't really answer this question because we don't really know, Joe. They may have been Persian priests. They may have been priests of the first temple royal priesthood in Jerusalem. Now, the order of Melchizedek that we hear about at every Mass, that I'll bet most people have no idea what they're talking about. The order of Melchizedek is that royal high priesthood, the first temple priesthood. They were expelled from the temple 700 years before Jesus. Where did they go? The kingdom of Nabateh. They went to Arabia. It had the largest Jewish community outside of Jerusalem. In fact, it may have been the largest in the Middle East at the time. What happens there is, I believe, some of these magi were the descendants of this first temple priesthood. They're immersed in the Jewish prophecies of the Messiah. They're looking to the skies for verification, a sign that the prophecy has come to pass, and they see it. When they do, they go to their king and they say, as they do in my book, there's a new king of the Jews, a new king of Judea. We have to go see him. Their king thinks, wait, Herod had a kid. Herod must have had a kid or a grandchild. Okay, go bring him tribute. And he sends these magi on a royal diplomatic mission, which, Joe, that's the only way they would have been allowed to pass through the borders between Nabatea and Judea. Herod maliciously and ruthlessly patrolled his borders. You couldn't just walk in with your camels. That's why this old idea of, the kings from different kingdoms and their caravan crossing several, empires to get to Judea, this is nonsense. This would never have happened. But a royal diplomatic mission from Nabatea to Judea may have happened. And that's why they'd go to Herod first. They don't go looking for the child first. They go to Herod because they have to follow the protocol. But their mission is to find this child. And I believe there was a religious impulse on the part of the wise men.
One of our listeners right now is asking the question, okay, well, what about those beautiful golden the tombs or these boxes that hold the remains of the Wisemen in Cologne Cathedral? Did you find anything
What about them?
Is it legit? Is it real? Have you busted that myth?
No. They may well be. They may well be the remains of these wise men. But the question is, how many are there? Where did they go? We don't know, Joe. History doesn't tell us. Now, there is some traditional belief that, and this makes sense, again, when you start to focus on the historical period, it doesn't narrow this story and reduce it. It blows it up and expands it. It gives it, I think, theological and spiritual importance that, frankly, I never got from the three tired old kings hanging around on the edge of the nativity scene. Oh, by the way, I hate to ruin anybody's Christmas. I'm not ruining your Christmas. I'm enriching it, I hope. They never came to the nativity. The wise men were not at the nativity. They were not there. They didn't come for months, probably 2 years after the birth of Jesus. And how do I know that? Why do I say such a horrible thing? Some people are upset. Oh, come on! You're taking the nativity away. You're taking the wise men out of Christmas. No, they very likely were not at the nativity, the birth spot of Jesus. They found him 2 years later. How do we know that? Who does Herod kill? He kills all the children 2 and under.
Hold that thought.
He doesn't kill the newborns.
We're up against a hard break for the network, and you were starting to talk about the timeline and how a lot of people misunderstand the timeline of the visit of these 3 wise men, not at the nativity, but sometime later. Can you pick up there?
Yes, well, this is why I wanted to really retell this story for families, because, look, we make a lot of conjectures based on statuary we see in churches or under trees, old stories we were told, or images from Christmas cards, and then we conflate that with the gospel. But the timeline in our head, the cultural images don't always square when you're talking about the nativity and particularly the wise men and their visit. The wise men very likely did not come to the Christ child for months, but probably 2 years after the birth of Christ. We know that because Herod doesn't, when the wise men don't return to him, and remember he tells them, go find the child, tell me where he is, I want to go worship him. Herod killed 3 of his sons and a wife to protect his throne. There was no way he was going to worship a new king of the Jews, I can promise you. So what happens is when the wise men scatter and don't come back to him, he puts out a death penalty. He puts out a hit, basically, on any child under 2 years old. If Jesus had just been born, he might have put a hit out on children newborn, or maybe 1 and under. The fact that he uses 2 and under tell us maybe that child was older and the wise men didn't reach him for some time after his birth. But whatever the case, this is not some staid, boring royal parade. This is a diplomatic mission with a religious impulse. And that's why I love the idea, Joe. Arabian horses were introduced into the kingdom of Nabatea 100 years before Jesus.
Wow.
That was the Tesla of the day. So if these wise men were traveling the 300 miles from Petra to Bethlehem, they were probably on those Arabian horses. So I put them on those horses in the book, and I love that image of them because they're racing toward the truth. They're racing toward the Messiah. They can't wait to get to him. That just gave a different feel, I think, to those tired old kings on the back of their camels. And by the way, king, those names, Melchior, Balthazar, Caspar, those were created by Venerable Bede 700 years after Christ. He was the one who gave them the names, the identity. And by the way, each of those names, they just mean king in different languages. Melchior's Hebrew, Kaiser's German, the other's a Semitic dead language. So those things, as sweet as they are, they don't really help us get in touch with the first century world, and I think the reality of where these wise men were and what they were doing and how it relates to our lives. And that's what I'm trying to do with the book.
Yeah. You know, one thing I thought about in your book, in the last segment, I talked about this American Girl doll book that just came out and is promoting transgenderism and puberty blockers, even behind parents' back even. It suggests that they just circumvent their parents' authority in all of this. The power, and I've been saying this for years, there's a war for the souls of children, and they're coming after them. And the power to manipulate the minds of children is a tool in the progressive and the modernist left. And here we are seeing a beautiful book that's not just meant to bring families together instead of tear them apart, but it's meant to educate them in a deeper, more profound level, which is one of the things I did find fascinating about your book, is that it's not just an illustrated children's book. It does have some depth to it.
No. Well, Joe, I thank you for saying that. I never write down to my audience, no matter who I'm writing. And I do the same thing on TV. You don't talk down to your audience. You try to raise up the discourse and raise up what they can consider and what you've discovered. And you have to labor for that. I write family reads. I don't write for children. People tell me, oh, you write children's books derisively. No. I write family reads because I'm writing for the child today who will be an adult tomorrow. And I've had that experience with my own children. You read literature, young person's literature, family literature. It changes on you as you grow. Peter Pan, Treasure Island, the Bible, those stories will shift on you as you get older. The story isn't changing. You're changing. What you know is changing. So you have to write higher. You have to write for the spirit. I write for the young and the young at heart. And you have to write for that entire audience. But my goal is really to bring families together. It's the opposite of what the American Girl book's trying to do, which is separate the child from the parent. I want to bring parents and generations together because it's there where I think a culture is refortified, where values and truths are passed on one generation to the other. And look, as an author, I only do 50% of the story. And Diane LaFayer, my incredible illustrator who brought this story, elevated this story, we only do 50%. We just put words and pictures together on a page. It is in the reader's mind and in the conversation they have where the story comes to life. And so the reader has half the job to do. I just have to lead them down the path. Let me get this in before we run out of time. This blew my mind. Margaret Barker, who is a incredible researcher and of the ancient world, translator of dead tongues. She translates for the Jordanese government and the Israeli government. incredible woman, Cambridge educated. Margaret has a theory that I now subscribe to, and I mentioned this in the last segment, that the Wisemen may have been members of that first temple royal priesthood. If that is true, Philo of Alexandria tells us in the first century there were 3 markings of that royal priesthood. 1, they had gold in their vestments. The order of Melchizedek, the royal priests, had that in their vestments, gold. They burned incense in that first temple, okay? And most importantly, and this is unique to the first temple, it didn't happen in the second temple, they kept myrrh oil in the Holy of Holies, the place reserved for God himself. Why? Because that myrrh oil was used only to ordain and anoint new members of the royal priesthood and kings. So when the Wisemen are running out and they're racing to this Christ child, it's not a gift drop-off. It may have been a part of their religious ceremony where they are initiating Jesus, the final high priest, the ultimate intercessor, the final connection between the old and the new. They are completing the circle of the first temple, restoring the first temple, and welcoming in that final high priest into their order of Melchizedek. That may have been what's happening here. And if that's the case, we see why Matthew opens his gospel with these wise men, why they have continued to survive all these centuries. We keep their figures under our trees. Our children play them in Christmas pageants. Why have they endured all this time if they're just people doing a gift drop-by? This is not a baby shower. This may have been something far more important and weighty and significant, and I think fascinating.
What is interesting to me was when I was going through, I attend a TLM, and so I was looking ahead to the third Sunday of Advent gospel. And when you look at Cornelius a Lapide and the early church fathers, they talk about how the Jews were looking for an Advent, but it wasn't the Christmas one that they were after. It was the final judgment one that they were expecting the Messiah to bring. So is there an aspect of these 3 men coming from Petra, seeking this Messiah from the heart and mind of ancient Judaism? Would they have been seeking the rise of the king that would bring about the final judgment?
Well, if assuming they're members of that royal priesthood, yes, that would be part of it. The other part is this holy wisdom idea, which you find in the Old Testament, which these first temple priests were obsessed with. The other thing, Joe, and again, I'm getting way into the weeds, but I love this so much. And if people want to know more, we're doing a Fox Nation special on December 16th. And how great that Fox Nation allows me to do a special like this, where I'm talking to biblical scholars, Father Dwight Longenecker, who did an incredible book on this topic, broke some new ground, astronomers. Really, we delve deeply into a lot of these issues, and it's a 30-minute special. The family can watch it. It's a lot of fun. But that myrrh oil, this is really interesting. If you go back and you read some of the Jewish literature, the Jewish legends and lore, the myrrh oil was known as the dew of the resurrection. They said that it actually came from the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. So when they're anointing, if that's what they were about, to anoint this Christ child, to anoint this Messiah, what they're really trying to do is restore Eden, which is what happens. He opens up and restores Eden. So there's a beautiful theological and spiritual circle being drawn, I think, with this story. A completion of the circle and the cycle in Christ and beyond him, through him. And but this idea of holy wisdom was very important to them. And the question is, and it is a question, what happened to the wise men after they left Jesus? Clearly they were transformed. And I love that they go, Fulton Sheen had that great line, once you encounter the Christ child, you can never leave the same way. We all leave by different paths. We leave renewed and changed. It's very likely they went to Damascus. Tradition tells us that's where they are, or where they went. It's interesting, later, St. Paul, after his conversion, he falls off the horse, and the gospel tells us he went to where? Arabia for 3 years. He vanishes. He's off the scene. Where does he go, Joe? Where does he go? We don't really know. But there is tradition to support that. There is no Christian Institute. He didn't go to Ave Maria or Franciscan University in East. He didn't. There was no such thing. There's a nascent persecuted church at the time. So where did he go for instruction? He may have well gone and may have spent time with these wise men. And if they were members of that royal priesthood, descendants of that royal priesthood, wise men of, if you translate it from the Hebrew, not only wise men from the East, but wise men of the ancient times, which is how it translates as well.
Wow.
If that's true, maybe that is where he received his particular, almost mystical training in the faith.
That would be amazing. Raymond Arroyo, God bless you, my friend. Thanks for being on with us today. We're out of time. Pick up your copy of The Wise Men Who Found Christmas at SophiaInstitute.com. That's SophiaInstitute.com. But if you would like to get a free copy, make sure you're on my email list. Go to grnonline.com/CDT and sign up to the insider email list today. I'll send you your instructions this afternoon. Raymond Arroyo, God bless you and God love you. Thanks for being on with us.